Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Aisha Dad. I'll be sharing some of my research with you today on mythology and video gaming and combining classics with game culture. And a start off with thanking the Leadership Innovation Lab for inviting me for this speaker series. And I'm excited to be here and share my research. So I'd like to start with giving a little bit of an overview of what I'll be speaking about, which are three main sort of topics. The first one is an introduction to mythology. What is myth? Where does it come from? And what is classical reception? And within that, I'll be taking a look at exactly what I said. What is myth? What is reception? Um, why do we continue to retell ancient stories? Um, and why is classical reception valuable to us? And from there, we'll move on to talking about gaming as an example of classical reception. Um, and there we'll take a look at, well, how is gaming a form of classical reception? How and why do games call upon mythology so often? Why are so many games based on ancient mythologies from around the world? What's the pull factor there? And then we'll take a look at what is the value of gaming as a pedagogical tool. So by which I mean, a teaching tool. So how can gaming be used to teach and understand mythology in the classroom, especially, and in research? And then we take it one step further to think about, what insights can gaming provide in the study of mythology? So how can it give us an insight that is unique and not available through other avenues? Let's get started with the first topic, which is mythology and reception, and then more specifically, classical mythology and reception. So, what is myth, right? Myth is a special kind of story. Um, it is in the ancient Greek world, the word myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which literally means something spoken or a word. And that has, two important facets to it. One is that it is something spoken. That means this is something that is transmitted orally, right, with oral storytelling. So there's a performative value in it, that these were stories that were performed and passed down in that way. And the study of that specifically is actually called oral poetics. Um, and the other thing that's connected to the idea that this means um, something spoken, that mythos means speech, is that it is a special speech, right? A special speech that, activates a special, that activated in a special setting, like a performance, like an oral transmission when people are gathered, makes this story particularly um, special. So it's in a way, sometimes scholars have spoken about mythology or the word mythos as marked speech as opposed to unmarked speech. Um, and so marked speech is again like special speech. And example of that, a modern example of that, of what do I mean when something is special speech or marked speech, right? Would be something in our society that we call something like speech acts, right? Which means that the word, for example, the words I do, are just the words I do, right? But spoken in a specific setting and a specific context, say at a wedding ceremony, right? They become special speech. They are powerful. They enact something. They actually have a power to do something, right? So they become marked speech. They become special speech. So when we look at the word mythology as we have inherited it in English, and its Greek root mythos, right? We're talking about something that is marked speech, something that is special speech, and something that has been transmitted orally. Now, um, what we'll be looking today at will be what we call classical mythology, right? And the, that essentially just really means that we're looking at the ancient Greco-Roman world, and in the way that disciplines go in academia, that is often called classical mythology or classics, though that term in itself has been under quite some scrutiny because there can be many kinds of classics, right? There's classical Persian, classical Chinese, from all over the world. So why is this called classics? Well, that would be getting into a whole nother conversation about, academic politics. But for the time being, oftentimes when we're talking about classical mythology, we're looking at the Greco-Roman world. I study comparative literature and comparative world mythology. So we can take a moment to zoom out and also share with you that a lot of world mythology, right? When we look at ancient stories from around the world, have this facet of oral transmission to them as well. Not all, but many. But also, they are special stories, again, that there is something about them that is special to the culture, to the ancient culture that produced them. So, on the most basic level, it is often sort of the shared trait, but of course, it can be different depending on which cultural context you're looking at. Right now, we're focusing specifically on the Greco-Roman world, but it is interesting to look at other cultures as well, as my research has led me to look at as well. But unfortunately, we don't have time for that um, in this particular instance. So, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about mythology, right? So, um, stories that are special speech from the ancient Greco-Roman world, and um, then what we're doing is that we're taking the next step and we're talking about reception. So now reception is an enormous academic field. It's, reception studies is not just related to the ancient Greco-Roman world, or, it is an entire field of study in itself. Um, but essentially, on the most basic level, when we talk about reception theory, it is about taking a look at how something has been retold in any kind of form. So it can have been retold not just in art, like in film, right, or another story, but it's how something can be retold even in architecture, right, even in music. Um, so in any kind of media, how it is retold. Um, and so when we look at classical reception, we're talking about how stories, the special speech mythology from the ancient Greco-Roman world is retold. And we know that the sort of Western world in particular has, again, also for political reasons, but also, just as its cultural heritage, has a lot of retelling of the ancient Greco-Roman mythology, and everything from Percy Jackson to, as we'll see, like a lot of video games. But let's take an example. Let's take a look a bit closer at some example of mythology and reception. So here I have an image of a of a gorgon, right, which also is known as one of the gorgon's names is a bit more familiar to us perhaps is Medusa. Um, so Medusa was one of the Gorgons or the Gorgo sisters. There were three of them. Two of them were immortal. One was mortal, whose name was Medusa. And famously, we know that she had sort of snaky hair. Here we have an image of a Gorgon. It's called an Attic black figure, 6th century before the Common Era. It's called black figure because in this style, the figures were in black pigment, whereas the background was in red pigment. This gets changed um, a century or two later, where the figures become in red pigment and the background becomes in black pigment, and those are called red figure vases. So oftentimes when we see a black figure vase, it's older, and so that is always exciting for us to see something so old. But if you take a look at this depiction, right, now when we look at ancient mythology, there's no such thing as an original source because we have scattered sources. And a lot of those sources actually are images. They might even predate sometimes the written forms of myth that we have. That's because in the ancient Greco-Roman world, myth, um, in the ancient Greek world specifically, myth was multiform, right? It was an orally transmitted poetry. Um, and it was multiform in the sense that there were many versions of it, and those versions could exist at the same time. It's a little harder for us to imagine that because we are very used to um, thinking of stories linearly, like they start from A and, end at Z. We read a novel from front to back, and that every time we have multiple storylines, we want to kind of reconcile them somehow. But for the ancient Greeks, that was not a problem. You did not need to reconcile all the different variations that existed of a story. Again, they were multiform. They just lived there. And let's sort of imagine this kind of multiverse, right? Um, out there. And you could see different versions crop up in different ways in different places. Representation on pottery was one of the biggest ones. Now, this one actually aligns quite well with the description that we have of the Gorgon, um, and that's from Apollodorus. We'll get to Versace in a second, but Apollodorus, right? And so the vase that we just saw actually predates um, this account of Apollodorus, right? But here we have another, right, instance of a description. And the Gorgon has to do with the story of Perseus. So the story of the hero Perseus. Perseus is out on a long story short. Perseus is an ancient Greek hero who is out on a quest to get the head of Medusa, one of these Gorgon monstrous sisters. And we get this information about them, and we find out that Perseus got an adamantine sickle, which is called a harpe, that's the original Greek, from the god Hermes, and caught the Gorgons while they slept. Only Medusa was mortal, and the Gorgons had heads with serpents, right? Coils spiraling around them, large tusks like boars, bronze arms, gold wings with which they could fly. And they turned whoever saw them into stone. So Perseus came to them as they slept, and while Athena guided his hand, he turned away, looked in a bronze shield by which he could see the Gorgon's image, and decapitated her, right? So he got the head. Now, this is sort of as original the story as we can get from the ancient sources, and we saw that black figure as well really reflected this quite well. It had the boar like tusks, right? The big bronze arms, the gold. It had wings, and then of course the most famous is the snake hair. Um, now when now this Medusa's image starts to become evolved already, quite so in the ancient world already. And if you go back and look at the very first image on these slides of the introduction, actually, that is also an image from the Perseus myth, where the goddess Athena on the right is, you know, urging Perseus on the left to be on his way, and he has a bag with the head of Medusa in it. But if you take a closer look at that image, you'll see that the little bit of the head of Medusa that you can see just looks like the face of a girl, of a maiden. So already in the ancient world, there was this shift of depicting Medusa from this very sort of boar-like monster to a beautiful maiden, and oftentimes with or without snake hair. But as time goes by, the snake hair really is what sticks, whereas the rest of her becomes this beautiful maiden. And that also comes from the fact that there's a different source of a story that shows her as a beautiful maiden, not as somebody who was a monster to begin with, which is the version that Apollodorus is talking about here, where she was just a monster, born monster, monstrous forever. But it's channeling another version of the myth, again, multi-form, where she was a beautiful maiden, and was assaulted by Poseidon, and Athena turned her hair as punishment because of lots of complicated reasons into snake hair. So then you have this beautiful maiden with snake hair. Anyways, so you see, we have this like what we could call some sort of original multiform from the ancient world, right? We can see it on vases, we can see in Apollodorus. We have this other myth as well, where she is a beautiful maiden whose hair is turned into snakes. So all of that from the ancient world, right? That is our myth. That's what we would call our mythology, our mythos, our special speech. Okay, so where does that go from there to reception, classical reception? Well, it's all around us. I am sure you've had interaction with seeing Medusa heads, right? Where you have the face of a beautiful woman with snake hair. And the way we have received Medusa and we retell Medusa is very much in the version where she is a beautiful woman with snake hair. We have not really received the version of the monster, right, with the boar tusks and the bronze arms and the gold wings. And one of the most what do you call it? Uh, Obvious, I guess, perhaps not the best word, um, examples of it that you'll come across around the world is the depiction by Versace, right? Versace's image, their logo is of the Medusa head, right, with the snake hair of the beautiful woman. And in an interview, when Gianni Versace was asked why the Medusa head, his answer was, well, it's because she's all about seduction, right? And so that's really interesting, right? So this is where reception gets interesting, where we have inherited this story, this image, we reuse it, we retell it, right? And reception can mean anything. Like we said, it can be in Versace's logo even, right? And then we assign to it what we sort of feel about it, right? We say, according to Versace, right, that this is an image of seduction. And that's not at all something that is there in the ancient mythology, the idea of seduction. Okay, so that is something that we have applied to Medusa. And that's where reception gets interesting, because that's where we start to ask, why did, you know, why do we retell it in this way? Why does Versace want to retell it in a way where this is about seduction? And this is where we can take it a one step further. We can say, what does that tell us about ourselves, right? Our society, that we not only have inherited and reused the image of Medusa, but we have assigned this idea of seduction to her, right? Is it some sort of fear of the feminine, right? Is it some sort of, our own hesitations about what female women represent in our society, what seduction represents? What does it tell us, right? That's where it gets sort of really interesting. So to now make our segue a little bit more towards the side of gaming, right, we can take a look at another way that someone like Medusa is represented. And I'll show you this image. This is the Dusa head from the game Hades. Um, and you can see here, right, again, a very interesting depiction. You do have a little bit of the tusk, but you have one big cutie snake wrapped around, holding a broom, and the Dusa head, which is this free-floating head. So it's always really interesting to see, right, whether it's also the free-floating head of Medusa or attached to a feminine body. But here, again, it's a free-floating head. The game designers, right, have chosen instead of doing a seductive female figure, like what Versace was thinking, here you have something that's very inherently innocent and cute, is usually what I get from most of my students when I ask, what do you see here? It's like, well, she's adorable and she has this cute little squeaky voice too, that makes her very sort of non-threatening. That's, really interesting. The snake is there, but is again like is sort of stylized in a hair form that is less um, intimidating than many armed snakes, if you will, because the snake is also holding a broom and the Dusa head is always sort of cleaning up, housekeeping in the game Hades. So here is a form of reception, right? The game developers of this game have taken the ancient concept of Medusa and have portrayed her in this Dusa head and have taken and have made decisions, right, whether consciously or not, to depict that Medusa head in a particular way. Um, Very different from something like Versace, if you will, right? Or what you could have done, right? Which is could have been a very intimidating, threatening figure. Here they have sort of stepped back on that. And so this is where we can start asking questions why, right? Um, and what effect does this have, right? What does it make us feel? Does it make us feel, um, uh, if you will, compassion for this Medusa figure, right? And then we can ask again, what does that tell us about us, right? Us as a society, about depicting it as this sort of cute, disarming, non-threatening figure, right? Are we wanting to take the sting out of it? Why, right? Um, and for that, if we were to go in and do a study of Medusa, which is a wonderful thing to do, we would maybe look into how Medusa has been appropriated and misused throughout um, history, and how sort of taking a non-threatening approach to her um, would be a great departure from what her usual reception is. So, we would sort of take a deeper dive into, in answering those questions, we have to take a much deeper dive, right? It's not as simple as just sort of um, as as me being able to share some sort of cool answer with you. I can only really help pose questions and show you how these things are applicable to our world, and answering them is a much deeper dive into research about them. But there's one other thing that I want to mention about reception too, is that it allows us to go, it's a two-way street, because we can think about what does it tell us about us, but it also allows us to go back and look at the ancient sources with fresh eyes, and it allows us to look at them with fresh eyes and rethink about them, right? And that's important too, because we're not looking at dead sources, we're looking at things that still keep giving, which is why it is a discipline that is still can be applicable to us, because we're constantly engaged in this sort of ancient mythology. So we can sort of, the research can go the other way too. So let's use this to now take an even deeper dive into gaming, now that we've figured out how the relationship between mythology and reception works. Okay, wonderful. So now let's take a look specifically at gaming as classical reception. Is gaming classical reception? Yes, very much so. Not all of it, of course, but the ones that do engage with mythology from the Greco-Roman world, yes, is classical reception. Any games that engage with mythologies from other parts of the world are also reception, not classical reception in its the way it's usually denoted, but they are very much reception, because as we said, reception can be in any media form, and gaming is I would argue sort of the most prolific form of reception currently in our society, right? And most of us are getting introduced to a lot of mythology through gaming. So yes, it is very much a form of classical reception, right? But and then we can ask why, right? Why does so much gaming look at ancient mythology to get its inspiration? Again, whether it's Greco-Roman or from other parts of the world. And it really comes down to this idea, which is narrative elements, right? And about game design. So when you're looking at game design, you need a narrative, you need world building, right? And you need narrative elements, especially for game design of games such as Hades, that are um, not puzzler games, but they are sort of uh, storyline based games, right? Um, you need narrative design for them, and for game design, right? You need to very very strong world building, and a lot of times it is much easier both to pull on ancient mythology for world building because it exists in such a fantastic way already, but also to market it because there are already communities of people that are familiar with it, right? So yes, you can come up with your own world building and produce something amazing, but it would be completely new to the audience, right? They would have to take a gamble on it a little bit. But if you're pitching a storyline that audience might be semi-familiar with, right? You are much more likely to have a pull, and because as I said, you just have so much world building already ready for you to use. Especially so in elements that I've broken down here. We're talking about mythological geography is a big one. The idea of the supernatural, right? Gods or goddesses, um, um, and you have heroes, right? Heroes or and weapons or gifts or boons, and monsters, right? So again, if any of those elements can be um, both already something that have a pull for the audience and are already readily available, it creates for a really dynamic combination. So, for example, going back to this the game Hades, which that I research quite a bit and play with my students quite a bit. Um, is for example has a big pull from the myth of Hades and Persephone, right? And the myth of Hades and Persephone is quite well known in this, in the Western Hemisphere has a very strong reception, history of reception. So many people are familiar with that. But if you play the game Hades, right, it is based a lot on mythological geography. And again, in the ancient Greek world, right, in the ancient Greek mythology, we have very strong world building of mythological geography. So all of this takes place in the underworld. And we have in the mythology extremely detailed descriptions of the underworld, different parts of the underworld, what's going on in the underworld. And that is a very easily allows for a really aesthetically pleasing and detail oriented world building, right? And the same thing with if you get a chance to play Hades, right? The gods and the supernatural beings that are sort of populated throughout the game. And what's really fun about Hades is that if you go farther enough, when you get to your gifts and your weapons, you can start collecting weapons of heroic figures from other mythological traditions, like from even King Arthur and other mythological traditions, Beowulf, for example. And so it starts to sort of like also dip into other mythologies as well that would be known potentially to its audience. But just to give you an example that like that it's very popular, right? To use mythology for world building and game building. We can look at our sort of other big hit that I've been researching, and it's part of my research and part of the teaching, is the Black Myth. video game, right? That is sort of really pulling a lot of its narrative elements from Journey to the West. And so we see that again, that there is, and again in its delivery too, right? There is already an excitement for audience such as myself who are familiar with the narrative elements of the story it's based on to see it and to engage with it. All right, so now we come to sort of the last part, which is talking about gaming and pedagogy, right? So we've seen how gaming very much can be a form of reception of mythology. Um, but what is its value when it comes to teaching, to pedagogy, right? How is it actually helpful in terms of engaging with this ancient corpus? Well, for someone like me who teaches a lot of video gaming and does gaming labs in my myth courses and spends a lot of time thinking about this, um, it comes down to the fact that there is an experiential link there. So, what do I mean by that? Well, as I talked at the very beginning of this sort of lecture, is that mythology, especially in the ancient Greek world, was connected to something called oral poetics, right? And if you're interested more in what oral poetics is, you could take a deeper dive into the most formative book called Singer of Tales, which is based on the work of a Harvard professor called Milman Perry and Albert Lloyd in the 1930s on Yugoslavic epics, in which their research on Yugoslavic epics actually led them to understand how oral poetics is working in things like Homer, and proved its origins in oral poetics. And one thing that they learned is this connection between what they call composition and performance, right? Which is that the singer who is going to be singing this story um, is making the stories, composing the story, weaving the story, if you will, in performance. So not for performance, not ahead of time, but in performance, right? So they're singing, performing, composing all at the same time. Essentially, right, what what receiving as an audience member, what that would have been like was that there is something about experiencing the myth, right, with your senses, um, that we have lost. Because now, right, a lot of times you assign Homer and or mythology, and you have students, right, sitting, looking at a book and just reading it like we are used to reading novels, right? And feeling as if it has always existed in this one variant that has come down to us and solidified. It's solid. There's nothing fluid about it. There's nothing experiential, nothing sensory about it. It's just this novel like, you know almost um, uh, non-fluid structure. And I think what we lose in that is an enormous part of what myth and what these stories were actually like to the in the ancient world, and to, if we were an ancient Greek, we would be listening to these stories, we'll be watching them performed, right? It's a sensory experience, right? We're not talking about something that was circulated in written form at all. This is until much later. This is an experience, right? And in fact, what Milman Perry and Albert Lord found is a lot of these singers, you did not even have to be literate to be a singer of tales. Um, and so what I find that when we engage with something like gaming, right, it restores a certain level of the sensory experience of being engaging with mythology, of what it's like to hear it, to see it, to experience it, and to understand its possible multi-form, multiverse being, right? What it must be like when things can move around, right? And things are fluid. And I think that experience, right, really helps tap into something that is otherwise gets lost. And so now when we're talking about how to teach it, also, what's the next step? Well, this is what a part of our research has been working on at the Classics Gaming Collaborative, which I should note in this thing is that the website is transitioning to a new website. So in case you're looking for the website and you're having some trouble with that, it is forthcoming, a new website. Um, but if you go to, for example, I'm going to click here, and if you go to the Applodorus project, um, this linked in this slideshow, you will find that we have been working on this database. It is a database of teaching where you can take a look at a video game and in that is has something to do with the ancient Greco-Roman world, and you can think about what texts can it be taught with, what narratives, what myths can it be taught with, for what themes is it discussing. And so you can really create this experience where you play a game in conjunction with reading or teaching a certain myth, and then you can have a discussion about what kind of themes are in that reception, right, where we talked about are retold in what way, to what purpose, and why, right, and really take them apart. So the Appledores project, which is right now, as you can see how when you go on this website, hosted by Paisaman, but a product of the Classics Gaming Collaborative, and is we are working hard on expanding it, is to build these tools to say, okay, how can we concretely use something like gaming in the classroom, in research, in conjunction with narrative sources from the ancient world, to think about reception, to think deeply about thematic questions and how they affect us and what do they tell us about our society, but also how they allow us to go back to these ancient sources with fresh ideas. Um, Thank you so much for giving me a chance to share with you my research. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I am always very excited to share research and opportunities with students. So please um, don't hesitate to email me or to research. Thank you so much.